Welcome to Black Lotus Buds. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Michael. Thanks for joining us.
We're kicking off our debut episode on the channel where we talk all things trading cards.
Today, we'll each cover a topic that aligns with our own individual passions. For me, that's going to be the card market and individual card prices.
And I'm going to be touching on the Magic the Gathering World Championship 30 that just concluded. And then we're just going to be ranting about everything in between.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take it away. And I'm just going to start with kind of my own personal passion, which was Pokemon. It's one of the things I've kept my whole life were my Pokemon cards. And I always got hyped when I used to watch like YouTube videos and they'd be pulling cards and telling prices. So I want to go over some of the Pokemon prices over various different platforms. And then I'll hit on Magic and some Sorcery, a new card, and some others before turning it back over to Kevin. So I decided I wanted to look at prices found on markets that real people use and not like the highest grossing card that's sold to some millionaire out there. So I went with eBay, TCG Player, and a place called Price Charting, which I think is not the most reliable source, but they pull from a lot of sources, so I like to use that too. So the kind of like top dog card that sells in Pokemon is the original base set Charizard. Now that puppy is around $8,000 if you have a first edition base set. And that's just like a plain card in a binder that doesn't have damage on it. And that's $8,000. Just, I always imagine if I was a little kid and I just had that puppy in good condition, like why didn't I do that? I would have thousands and thousands of dollars. And that gets hyped. And then they have other cards. If you go to TCG Player, you know, it's kind of hard to find a base set Charizard out there on the market. But TCG Player, one of the top selling cards as far as price-wise, are these promotional cards. They're not even cards in the playable game. They're promotional cards where it's a picture of a Pikachu in like a poncho. Like, I don't, Kevin, have you even heard of those before? Like the little poncho Pikachus?
Nope.
They're literally like it's like a hoodie that has like a Charizard head or, you know, a different Pokemon. They're like wearing a poncho as if they were at a Pokemon theme park or something. And those puppies are selling for $2,000, between $1,000 to $2,000. And those are things that are like have been selling and are still up for sale. Jeez. And then I wanted to get like a crown jewel. Like, you know, what's the top card? And I eliminated, there's an Illustrator Pikachu that's like a 101 from some rare art contest, but of like a normal card, it's another Charizard. It's the base set, but this one's shadowless, which was like a rare set of cards that printed without shading on it. And if you have a mint one that is graded and authenticated, this is literally, if I could work my whole life, I could buy a house. But if you had this one card, it's $347,000. And that card is sold. So that's not like a speculative, that's not for sale. That's from a listing in April off of eBay. Like a human being bought that and swiped their debit card, and that got shipped out to them in the mail.
They've got
like that.
It's a nice debit card.
Go ahead. Yeah, they definitely have a platinum.
Yeah.
Like an ultra gold or something. But, you know, I didn't want to stick with Pokemon. That's kind of like some old news stuff. The Poncho Pikachu is kind of interesting. But in general, for Pokemon, and this goes with Magic, and even some niche games, like I'm into one called Sorcery, the high-value cards are typically around $100. So if you have the newest set of Pokemon, you find the most rare singular card or the most hype card, it's usually about $100. Now, in the Americas, that typically tends to be like a popular Pokemon, an Umbreon, a Lugia, a Charizard. And in Japan, for whatever reason, they like trainer cards. It's like full art trainer cards, and they're usually of like cute girls, but they're not like, you know, MA, you know, X-rated card. It's just a trainer card, but that's what they're into. So it's different markets, but it's about $100. And the same goes with Magic. So their cards, if you pull like a top dog card, a lot of times it's around $100 to $200. An example of that would be in the new Duskborn set. There's one called Overlord of the Hauntwoods. And Kevin was actually teaching me a little bit about, useful cards versus just like rare cards to pull. And these ones are going to be just the rare cards to pull with the raised kind of embossed look to them. But they're a little more valuable. I don't know if that's because they're that much more rare, but they're still close in there. If you're just a typical guy, you have the potential to be pulling 100 to 200 card in pretty much any of these card games. Now, when I went hunting for the Magic cards, we got to probably something that most people into Magic would recognize already, and that is the Black Lotus. Now, on price charting, they pull from different places. It listed it between $24,000 to $42,000. Now, Magic is older, so that makes a little bit of sense just because from a time perspective, like it's harder to have good condition cards as the years go by. But if you look at TCG Player, this is where I would go if I'm buying a card and I don't really care about the condition. I just want one that's in decent shape. There's one called Time Twister, and it's a $4,000 to $6,000 card. So I was trying to figure out, if we go to eBay, what's the, having been sold. And this was kind of an interesting one. It was a signed Black Lotus, which you would think anything with an authenticated signature that's also gem mint would be skyrocketed in value. But that sold for $30,000. Just kind of crazy numbers. Not as crazy as the Pokemon, and I don't know if that's an audience thing or it could also be a demand thing. Like if you have a Black Lotus and you're some old guy with Magic the Gathering original alpha cards, you might just be keeping it. You might just not sell it, which may be part of the issue is why they don't sell. In the last couple sets of cards, I'm going to talk about some sorcery, and then touch on some of the other trading cards very briefly. But sorcery is a card game that spawned on Kickstarter, and it became the highest grossing Kickstarter of all time. But there are several others that are also born of Kickstarter that do have their own trading markets. But for sorcery, I was trying to look up the best cards, and there was on eBay a Philosopher's Stone Alpha Foil. So it's the first print run of cards. It's hard to find, and it's shiny. And that sold for $10,000. Now that really kind of genuinely surprised me when you're comparing it to a Black Lotus that's signed on eBay that's only $30,000. That's in mint condition. But I think that just has a little to do with hype. People get hype into new things. That's why, all these $100 cards you pull, if you pull them in the very first week of any set, you might sell them for $150 or $200, and then you'll see it drop soon after that, after, people forget about it or they move on to the next one. We also had a Pathfinder Alpha Foil that is selling on the TCG Player for $1,000. Now that puppy is valued that way, I think, not only because it's, the original and it's shiny, but Pathfinder is actually an avatar. So it's like your main card. It's your boss, basically. You're battling. I think it's similar to what Kevin's described as a commander format. And I think people want to show off. So I think that's why that's priced up there. But in general, the rarest cards in this game are about $2,500. They're rare, like 1 out of every, 40 boxes. And they're called curio cards. They're supposed to be almost like one-off cards. You don't ever really expect to even get one. And if you do, you'll never expect to get the same one twice. So that's why they're selling, because out of pure rarity. They don't even function in the game. So you'll see a lot of cards, valued at 30 or 40 that are playing in Pokemon competitively, in Magic competitively, and the same with sorcery for a lesser degree, because I think the competitive play is less than the collectible market. And I wanted to touch on just Yu-Gi-Oh! I just looked up one card, because Yu-Gi-Oh! I think is in the big three with Pokemon and Magic. And I felt that I couldn't leave it out of this discussion. And I looked up on eBay the last sold card. It wasn't even graded. No grading, no authentication, and it sold for $15,000. So off of that, I mean, it makes Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're looking to pull value, and that's the only data point you have, it looks pretty good. And then I wanted an honorable mention on sports cards, because I thought they were like the OGs. and there is two I thought were mentionable. There's a Leroy Satchel, don't know who that is, a baseball card from 1948 on eBay that did sell. It was $35,000. But here's the crazy thing. The grade was a 3. And like a 3 on a PSA card is like one that you might have picked your teeth with. Like you might have shaved a piece off to start a fire. Like the PSA 3 is rough shape, man. Like that is not your pristine card. But I think because it's so old, I mean we're 1948. It's probably one of the original trading cards. Period. Is probably why it's valued that way. And then I wanted something more reasonable. There was a 2018 baseball card that did sell. I mean, that's like 7 years old now, or 6 years old, and it's $14,000. So the point in me saying all this is just to be like, dude, the card market is hype, and there's value in pulling out cards. And so if you're like me and you're into the thrill of pulling cards, or you're even like Kevin's taking a journey with Magic the Gathering, it's like, there's no reason not to be ripping boxes. Like, get one you like, get one that has value. Like, this is the time in the market to do it. Now, before I turn this over to Kevin, I did want to mention a lot of card communities are based around flipping sealed product. And I'll probably do some fair share of talking about that, but my particular passions are all tied to just like ripping open packs, and I keep the ones I want. I want some high valued ones. And I'll probably PSA grade some cards, but, you know, I'm not really into hoarding boxes and reselling them and talking about that stuff in bulk for myself, because I don't do it. But everybody should be hyped, because you could rip packs and sell a card for $200 the next day on eBay, and you save them for, 20 years, and these things are appreciating better than, Fortune 500 stock. It's kind of crazy. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin, and let's hear what he has to say about Magic the Gathering.
Well, I do want to quickly add, based off what you said with your 3-rated card there you discovered with the Sporting World, Blacker Lotus. This was a card that came out more or less as a parody to Black Lotus. And I love this card because it is just truly hilarious for any Magic the Gathering player, where it reads as an artifact. You can tap it, and then this is what it says: tear Blacker Lotus into pieces. Add 4 mana of any one color to your mana pool. Play this ability as a mana source. Remove the pieces from the game afterwards. It's a beautiful way of representing the unique and rarity of Black Lotus, and incorporating into a funny little way of just saying, you know what, we're going to take that, we're going to make it easier for everybody to play with this card, but it's still such a good card, you're going to need to rip it up and just dispose of it when you're done with it. And I haven't yet...
Is it supposed to be like it's blacker than Black Lotus because you're literally diminishing the pool of cards available because you rip it in half?
And it's 4 mana as opposed to 3 mana with Black Lotus.
Okay.
So it was a little bit better, but it comes at a cost. You basically have to destroy it and not use it ever again if you're going to play it. And it's still a 0 mana cost card to play, just as Black Lotus was. So pretty funny, and kind of segues off what you said with the sports card. And then again, my passions with this are really just Magic the Gathering, heavily on centered around tournaments and just competitive play. I got into the game years ago, I would say maybe 3-4 years ago, and just fell in love with the online world of Arena, which is a wonderful app if those of you are interested in Magic. And it's just a fun way of playing with your friends, playing with strangers, or just playing against the AI robot and just learning how to play the game. A little bit easier to understand than perhaps play in real life with one of your friends, unless they're talented and understand the rules. But even with an experienced player, a lot of these new sets incorporate new mechanics, and with those new mechanics come new strategies and new rulings. So it really begins to unfold into this wild world, which we all love so much. So jumping right on in, I'll be discussing again the Magic the Gathering World Championship 30, which just concluded. And it was really neat right off the bat to see how many countries were represented. And from there, we had a lot of top players from previous tournaments, ones that we have seen throughout the years. And again, me being a novice and new to the competitive world, this was beyond exciting to see with all these players who are super good at the game and really knowledgeable when it comes to using the archetypes of Duskmourn and Standard. So the draft archetypes of this set were pretty wild. They included some weird mechanics, new ones, which were enchantment rooms, manifesting dread, and impending spells. Impending is a really neat new rule. It's very similar to one that's been about in the game called Suspend, but impending is, I'll give you a quick ruling on this. This is actually impending. If you cast this spell for its impending cost, it enters with X time counters, and the card would tell you how many time counters it is, and it isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. So it sits there on the battlefield. It starts to intimidate your opponent, and then after just a few turns, that card enters the battlefield without you paying its mana cost, and it begins to set the tone for the match. Back to the tournament and Duskmourn itself, there was plenty of Signpost Uncommon cards, which are 2-color cards that help push the strategy, especially in draft, and just a ton of common cards that were great removal cards out of Duskmourn. So that's always fun to see in draft. It really makes for an exciting tournament. And what's really neat, in my opinion, is the value of any given card will change depending on which deck you build. So what strategy you decide on, and in draft, keep in mind you only have maybe 2 or 3 deck ideas to peruse before you heavily commit to what you're going to do in that draft setting. You build your cards. I think it's 14 times 3, which would be 28, something around about 40 cards. And then from there, you just turn that into a 40-card deck and try to win. Best out of 3. It got really dicey. Simon Nielsen was the player right away with the most attention, most focus. He had high expectations, but I think they were well placed as he was coming in as the 2022-2023 Player of the Year with 6 top finishes. And also they noted that he started playing in 2011. He probably played before then, but that's probably when his competitive side started to shine and he started entering and winning tournaments. And he really was really fun to see. Out of the gates, when his draft pack is finally opened and it's the real deal, what was really wild is that he picked Unable to Scream, which is, I think, a common card, leaving the rare card in that pack, pass it over to his pod member to his left, and was like, all right, I'm already setting the tone with his knowledge. You know, most players, if you're playing draft for fun or maybe not a whole lot of experience like myself, you're looking at that shiny card, you're looking at the rare card, anything mythic comes your way, that's going to set the tone and perhaps your strategy for that whole draft tournament environment. So it's really cool when you see somebody who really understands the colors of the set already. They go in there, they know exactly what they're looking for, how they're going to build their deck, and are okay with losing out on a rare to, you know, take their strategy and start to produce magic, which is exactly what we saw. He finishes round 3 in his draft pod on day 1 with another win to finish 3-0, which again was probably not anything out of the ordinary, but for watching him and seeing that happen in real time, it was pretty fun to watch. And I did make a note here. I think his pivotal moment in pack 2 during the draft rounds when he sees Disturbing Mirth and Scorching Dragonfire, and he had to make a decision. He ends up filling his deck in pack 3 upon finding a lot of black and red cards to work with his Disturbing Mirth strategy, and that ended up pretty much solidifying the deal. Every game that he played seems like he was using his graveyard, or as other experienced players call it, the yard, and he was pulling stuff out of the yard all day long, and it was just a wild experience just to see his opponents recognize how talented this gentleman really is at the game. And again, a wonderful experience to watch. And I have to ask, Michael, have you watched any Magic tournaments?
No, not at all.
Well, you're missing out. There was over 15,000 viewers at sometimes I was looking at on both YouTube and on Twitch. There was just a lot of excitement, and the announcers did a great job.
I think it would be nice to have an announcer kind of walking you through, because I don't know a whole lot about the mechanics of Magic the Gathering. So it would be nice to have that kind of announcer box telling me play by play what's going on.
Oh yeah, and they're rattling off. They're knowledgeable themselves, so they're talking about cards that, maybe if this player has this card, this would be a great follow up from the card that was just played. Those sorts of things. So it really made for a wild experience, because you're able to recognize playing, with Duskborn and playing draft. Even on Arena, it's easy to follow along with some of these card names that get thrown out and say, oh, yeah, I know about this guy. I've been punished by the unstoppable little minion over here, and I'll get to that guy later. But day 2, another wonderful day. Jean-Emmanuel Depraz ended up being a hit, drafting blue-green with a little black splash. So heavily on the blue and green, which is not necessarily a favorable archetype in Duskmorn, but it all depends on the player. And what I love most about Magic, and I'm sure with many of these other card games, it's all about skill as much as it is luck. So it really comes down to understanding what deck you're building, especially in that quick draft, quick environment where they only have seconds to decide which card they're pulling out of that pack and keeping for their deck that they're going to build, and seeing how that strategy plays out. And you got to hope that you're going to pull the right cards in the beginning. Otherwise, we all know, mulligan and take in only 6 cards to start, throwing 1 on the bottom of your graveyard, or rather your library. And that we saw in day 3, where there was a gentleman who actually started with 4 cards and ends up winning. And I do believe that might have been JED himself. But day 3 comes around, and I'm going to jump right to it. Spoiler alerts. We have the winner as Javier Dominguez. He becomes the world champion, and for the second time, which was another impressive stat to add to his belt. The trophy was beautiful, and he ended up winning with a Dimir Demons archetype. So, again, for those of us who may not know too much about these archetypes, I looked it up for you. That way you don't have to. Dimir focus on incremental advantages, library depletion, aka milling, and evasive creatures. And what really solidified his board state in his final match was this card, Archfield of the Dross. Look it up on Arena, look it up online. It is a wild card. You really have to be knowing how to use it when you play it, because it enters with 4 time counters on it, and when the last is removed, you would remove 1 each turn. You would remove 1 on the beginning of your turn, and once the last is removed, the game is over. You lose. End of it. So you really have to be smart when you play that card, and you would pretty much want to kill it yourself if you have to avoid it getting to that final point where that final time counter is removed. So it makes really, really exciting card. I think it's a 6/6 with flying. It doesn't have haste, thank goodness. Otherwise, it'd be a nightmare. But it was really fun to watch, and a really cool way to end that game. Put him in the number 1 spot. So that was really the news of this podcast that we wanted to dive into and share with you all. And now we can kind of go off on a tangent, and I would love to talk about Magic more and my favorite card right now, Unstoppable Slasher. I mentioned him earlier. He is a little tiny devil, the little guy. So what this guy does is whenever Unstoppable Slasher deals combat damage to a player, they lose half their life rounded up. When he dies, if it had no counters on it, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with 2 stun counters on it. So you really just need exile this card out of the game. Otherwise, he's just going to be hanging out. He might take a couple turns and dust himself off, and he'll come back with a vengeance and continue to try to cut your life in half. And did I not mention it? I didn't. He has Death Touch. That's a fun mechanism in the game where if he touches you or he touches any of your creatures, not you per se, he could touch the player all day long. It's not going to defeat the player immediately. But if he touches a character or a creature that's blocking him, he's just going to kill that creature. Death Touch is unstoppable, hence his name, Unstoppable Slasher. And I'm giving him the title he only because the card looks like a guy holding a saw blade in the fiery pits of hell, and he is labeled as a zombie assassin. So I've gendered him, but who knows? It could be a they, them, or a she. Either way, it is a wild card and a fun card to throw into your deck.
Yeah, that definitely seems like a card you want working for you and not the other way around.
No. It's always fun to see that card show up, especially when Bloodletter is also on the battlefield. What Bloodletter is a 4-mana spell. It's a creature, and it is whenever the opponent were to lose life during your turn, the opponent will lose half their life. What an insane win con with both of those cards on the battlefield, because with Unstoppable Slasher, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they lose their half their life rounded up. And if you've got that Bloodletter on the battlefield, it's going to once again deal the rest of the damage to your opponent, and that usually is enough to put them in their place, and they either will concede or accept defeat. But that's pretty much how that tournament went. It was a lot of fun, and Duskmourn is a great set. If you haven't gotten a box, get a box, or just get a small booster box, something that's attainable and easy to peruse through the cards that are available. You never know. You might hit one of these top-selling cards like Michael was talking about and find yourself with an Overlord.
Dude, I feel like it's so hard if you're like a player in any of these games. And I mean, I ran into this in Sorcery, and I literally bought that specifically to just see how much I could sell stuff for on eBay if I bought it. I mean, I like the game itself, but I don't have a lot of people to play with. And I found a card, and it was foil, so it's worth more shiny. But it just said, when King Arthur and Guinevere are on the same, if they are occupy this space, you win. And I'm just like looking at that, and I feel like if I am somebody who is super competitive in the game, I probably can't let that go, right? Like, because you want it. You want to use it. So there's this, like, fine line if you're playing competitively in Magic. It's like, obviously, if you find a card that's going in your deck, it doesn't matter how valuable it is. You got to keep that puppy.
That's really neat. What was fascinating when you were talking about Sorcery off air, you had said lands are pretty much how you interact with your opponent and build off of the land. And that's what's wild with Magic, and maybe you can help dive into that more here, but with Magic, it's very much a land is similar to Pokemon in that it's energy and mana. You are able to spend it to cast spells, creatures, enchantments, and so forth. But help us out with lands in Sorcery more.
So in Sorcery, the lands, they also act similarly to like an energy because they provide mana, which is required to do pretty much everything. Cast monsters, cast spells, to do all the stuff. And they also provide like an affinity, which is a secondary requirement. Like it's more of a threshold you have to reach before being able to do certain casts. But what makes it special is that it's like a game of chess or expansion, where you're not just, fighting with your cards, casting spells and monsters, because you're doing that, but you're also expanding your realm. So you're actually building the board out dimensionally, and you can only spawn your monsters on your territories, but once the game is going, you can cross over into the other person's land. And there's all sorts of strategies that come from this. And I've only played a few games, but that card I mentioned earlier, it was a $1,000 alpha foil. It was the highest that you could see on TCG Player. And I feel like that's probably a little higher than it should be, but that was what it sold for. And it said that when you start the game, it allows you to just take your first land card as your draw and place it in the corner of the map. And it's like that move alone, it now completely interrupts your opponent's style. So, you're used to facing off across from each other, and you have a couple spaces in front of you and a couple spaces left and right. But if your opponent just starts on a corner near you, it's like, what damage can they do? Are you prepared for someone to just immediately start casting? It's kind of chaotic, and I'm not a great... I don't know how to play chess, and I used to be good at checkers. I'm not even sure I'd be great at that. But it adds a whole nother level of gameplay. So it's not quite like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the Magic or the Pokemon. It's also this kind of build your domain kind of game. And I think because of that, it's probably a less serious competitive game than Magic the Gathering, because the rules are a little too complicated. It's to where, if you're sitting down with your friends or your family, you might be arguing about whether or not, one player can do something. It's not as cut and dry. So, the game is new. They're on their second set of cards. So you might see it get more serious, or you might see it, fade away. But I think it might be have the intention of being a little more casual than Magic. But I don't really know. I guarantee you, if you talk to the guys that are playing in the tournaments, which they have now, and they're having a sorcery con, either coming up or happening like this month or now, pretty much. And I bet you they would disagree, and they would say it's a highly competitive game because that's what they're into. But I don't know. I found it a little awkward, but very fun to play. I want to play Magic too, and I'm attracted a lot to Arena, because if I could pop into a sorcery, I'd be playing every night, like a sorcery arena. But they just have a tabletop simulator right now. But Magic, it's like the only reason I didn't finish the tutorial was because it kept crashing while I was getting my brakes added onto my car. I was like on the last tutorial phase, and it would just close the app. So I'm gonna try again on my computer, but I'm hoping to kind of get into, like, breach that awkward phase of learning phase, that curve where you're like, oh god, I don't want to learn something new. Like when you were going over the competitive tournament, Kevin, it was like you were explaining a lot, but a lot of it was just like it would raise more questions than answers, because I'm so new. But I'm hoping that if I play Arena a bunch, that it'll all just kind of, just come about itself. Now, how long have you been playing Magic now, Kevin?
It's been about 3-4 years, and I got into it.
years.
Yeah, and there was pre-made decks that my buddy and I played with, where it was really easy. There was already a strategy, an archetype already of the deck. And as you're playing, if you play with the same deck, you begin to quickly understand this is the strategy of these two colors within this deck. And that might change in a different set with the same two colors. But it makes for an easy way to begin learning the game, processing the sequence of events, what happens during your turn, and most importantly, when an instant can be played, because it really can be played like it implies at any time, but not every single time. Pretty much, there's always a counter to any action. So the opponent does, in most cases, have the ability to respond if you do something with haste, or and playing a instant at the end of an end step, for example. But that's all lingo, and it's very easy to dissect the game in little bits when you are following along with a pre-made deck. I couldn't recommend Arena enough. They already have ways of just learning the game from having zero experience. You can just download it and then begin to understand what colors work with other colors. Or if you like just a monocolored deck, what cards work well with each other, and then build off of that. And it always, in my book, always ends with the beautiful balance of skill and luck. Because as skillful as you can be, you still need to draw a good hand right in the beginning of the game to set the tone and ultimately defeat your opponent. But it's fun.
I think it's funny because I know you talked a bit about this with Magic the Gathering having like these kind of bullshit combos, and Sorcery. I saw a YouTube video that basically was like, this is the most frowned upon combo, and it's like this, basically infinite loop. And it's funny because I always thought Yu-Gi-Oh was that way. Like they would have these cards, and you would flip out a magic card or a trap card, and it would activate, and you would just now be cycling through your deck, and your opponent would basically just sit there and watch you reshuffle your deck like 14 times. And it's interesting to see that all of these games basically have a few variations of that going on.
Oh, yeah. And notably, as soon as you say that, I'm sure the Magic the Gathering listeners are like, yep, I know which one you're talking about. And that's these mill decks. And of course, mill's embedded into the strategy. It works for some players. Some players love it. But it can be rather disappointing and defeating when you're playing against another player whose mission is only just trying to get your cards into the yard and do everything possible to not allow you to play the game. You finish by not having anything to draw out of your library, and that's how you lose.
You mentioned decks that specialized in like the yard. Now, is that like a good counter, like a deck built to drag stuff out of your yard? Like if that came up against it, would it win?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because yes, that would be a great strategy. If them milling you, you could now use that to your advantage and begin to, much quicker than you would on average, start to find cards that you would be able to utilize and get them out of the yard back onto the battlefield. The only problem is that, and this is not necessarily a problem, it's how Magic works. Whenever there's a strategy that might be overpowering, there's going to be a card or a strategy that comes in to calm that strategy down. And there are cards where you can simply exile target opponent's graveyard. So in one swoop with one card, and if the other opponent doesn't counter it, you can just lose everything that was in the graveyard. Exiling means removing it from the game. Now, good thing is it's not like Black or Lotus where you have to shred the cards and throw them in the trash can when you're done with them. They're just simply out of the rest of that game, and it leaves you a lot less to work with, especially if they've milled half your library and then just say bye-bye and exile your entire yard.
Yo, you mentioned Black or Lotus earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a card. It's actually one I set aside in my collection that it's iconic from the first set because it also requires you to rip it up. And it's like, if I recall correctly, I think it's basically useless. Like, you rip it up to draw another card. So it's literally just kind of meant to be a collectible and not function in the game. But I can't wait for them to come out with Blackest Lotus, where you just have to rip half of your deck in half.
The more valuable the card, the higher chance you have at winning. It's a dangerous strategy, but worth it for those who don't see money as an obstacle.
So is Black Lotus, is that valuable because it's just old and rare, or do people still use Black Lotus?
Well, that opens up an entire discussion for what different modes, I would call them. Probably getting the name or grouping wrong here, but there's standard, where this would be packs and decks that are of the more recent years. And this is a really fun rotation where after several years, they'll say, okay, these older decks and packs and whatnot, these older sets, I should say, are going to get removed and we're going to add more. So we're going to keep it pretty much with just the newer cards. Something like Black Lotus would be in probably, gosh, I think the term is like timeless, I think is what they're looking to get it into. Where it's just any card that's been printed, you're able to play with. And I'm sure there's like Explorer. There's a whole bunch of different variations of this, but there are ways where you'd be able to see that in person if somebody was willing to, hopefully not play with a graded 9 or 10, but something that they would be able to proudly showcase in a game. But there's more reasonable Lotus-like cards to play with. I have one myself in my collection I pulled from Time Spiral Remastered. It's called Lotus Bloom, and it's a copy essentially of Black Lotus. It does still have the tap it, sacrifice it, and then add 3 mana of any one color. The only kicker with this one is that it has suspend 3 with a 0 mana cost. So rather than play it from your hand, you would pretty much pay 0, exile it with 3 time counters on it, and then at the beginning of your turn, you're going to remove a time counter, and then when the last is removed, you can play that card without paying its mana cost. So it really does embody Black Lotus, but allow the other opponent to see that it's about to enter the battlefield and have something hopefully to use to counter it. A lot of the time, if you're playing anything against a blue deck, if they've got untapped mana, that's a telltale sign that they're either bluffing or they've got a card in their hand that might be able to counter what you're about to play. So you always have to be on your toes when you're playing against a blue deck and you see some untapped mana, because a big spell you play that might cost 7 or 8 mana could result in them only spending, say, 2 or 3 mana and just saying, nope, I'm going to counter that. Sorry. But
Man,
fun strategies.
I'm kind of bummed that we live so far away, because I'm literally like 6 feet away from a box of Duskmourn. Like, I could just start building decks.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I mean, I guess I'll do that with the arena a little bit too. It's not quite the same. I want to do both, I guess.
You would.
I want to play in person as well.
Yeah. It's fun to organize your collection, and that's the other thing. It's always great, like you were saying earlier, rip open some packs if you haven't done it, in a couple years or a couple months. It's fun, and you get to add new cards to your collection, especially if you're buying one of these brand new sets like Duskmourn. And these new mechanisms allow you to introduce whole new strategies into a deck that you've had for a while, or just building a deck right out of the gate with one of these new strategies. I mean, these enchantment rooms are wild. You begin to unlock a room and leave another room locked. You could open and unlock both of the rooms at the same time if you have enough mana, and that introduces a whole new concept and a whole lot more weight on enchantments and enchantment removals. There's a crazy blue and red archetype deck that just is nothing about rooms, and there's a fun card. I would need to look it up to tell you what the name is, but it destroyed me. I had no idea this card was in existence until I lost to it in a ranked match, and it was a card that merely is, when you unlock this room, if you control 7 other rooms, I believe is what it reads, you win the game. It's one of these where it's a win condition that you are pretty much betting that the other opponent is not going to notice, and then all of a sudden it's just too late. You just pop that room open and the game's over.
I would be motivated. I just want to have a deck of otters that is just bullying you. Like, just these otters, they're just messing you up, man. Like a Bloomborough set of cards.
Oh, yeah.
I think that would be one of my favorite parts of collecting any of these, and I haven't really gotten into that yet, which is building decks. Because that used to be back in the day with Pokemon, that's what you really did.
Yeah, you're trying to play the game, not just collect them, but use them to fight your friends. And you say otter. There's a fun otter. He's a mythic card from Bloomborough. He's called Storm Splitter. And he is a really wild card that it introduces a strategy where if you have another creature that allows all your creatures to be tapped for mana, the duo of both of these creatures on the battlefield is wild, because you can end up creating an almost infinite loop where these otters start to replicate. And if anybody's played Bloomburrow, they know how the rabbits are terrifying, because they seem like they're just a 1/1 boring old rabbit, and then they begin to multiply and multiply at such a high speed. If you don't have creature removal spells or counter spells, it can be very hard to get an edge on those decks. But this particular card, Storm Splitter, is whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a token that's a copy of Storm Splitter, which so it creates a copy of itself with the same ability. And what's wild is if you begin to now have multiple creatures like that and begin to tap them for mana, and then playing something like a sorcery or an instant that now creates more of them, the ones that are entering the battlefield are they're not tapped, so they have the ability to either be tapped for mana if you again have both those cards on the battlefield, or they can immediately go ahead and attack the other opponent. And in my case, I lost to a player who ended up, as a courtesy, stopping at 160 creatures before attacking me all in the same turn. And I think I only had somewhere around 30 life. So I was thinking I was further ahead. You only start with 20 in like a standard ranked match. And it was pretty wild to see his deck expose into this absurd army of otters. Yeah, if you like otters, that would be the way to go.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, you're used to battling like maybe up against like 15 creatures sometimes if somebody has the right mechanism in their deck. But to get to 80 and then he doubled it to 160 because everything was creating a copy of itself, it was like, bravo. I would love to see how this plays out, because all I could do was defeat his large creature that was like a 5/6, 5 power and 6 toughness for those of you listening. And that was nothing compared to the 159 other creatures that were attacking me with 1 damage.
It's funny because I feel like these cards are just... I mean, Sorcery had this too. In my experience, I guess, is old. Like, it's old Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's old Pokemon. And I played Sorcery, and there were some cards that I literally, because we're talking out the rules, and they're not really elaborate on a lot of it. It's just follow what the cards say.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, he's just teleporting around on one of the lands. And I was like, well, that doesn't seem like you should be able to do that. I mean, that seems a little unfair, to be honest. And that was the point of the card. And it's hard for me to wrap my head around, like, Magic does that too, where it's like, I think that's part of the fun, is getting these crazy combos and just being like, well, wait a second, you have, how many otters do you have right now? Like, excuse me?
And it also could be the like infancy of that game itself, Sorcery, where there hasn't been a library of, to put it in perspective, Magic with over 20,000 unique cards. If we start getting into like reprints in different formats or different card types, foil and
I think
foil,
they have. I could be wrong, but I think there's 2 sets, and there are only 400 cards per set.
Okay.
And now maybe that's one set's 400, maybe a different one was less or more, but I think that, so we're looking at about 800 cards for Sorcery. And I gotta be honest, I feel almost overwhelmed by that. What was the version of Magic where you said they stick it to like the last 3 years?
Standard.
So if I were, someone listening, or me myself, this is how I'm going to go. I'm going to try to get into Magic, learn on Arena, and then just pick the newest set and use it as my starting point. Learn those cards, and then at least I know in about 3 years I'll have the knowledge to play competitive Standard. And then, any of the, older cards and the older play style, it's like, if I ever get into that, that's fun, but it just seems so overwhelming. Like, how the heck would I ever compete with some guy that's like, I mean, that's so many cards. Like, how do you even start?
Exactly. And if anything, I would recommend just jump into it if you haven't played Magic before, or you might be somebody who plays a little bit, but Arena's a great way to play a lot more, and not have to worry about inviting friends over. You can just play online with, like I said earlier, you could play with the computer if you don't want to play against anybody online. And it's a great way to learn new strategies. You can even just go into a non-ranked match and just play against somebody and see what they're doing, and kind of, let them defeat you, and exposing as many of their cards as you can, so you can try to understand what strategy works for them. And, that's an easy way to learn too. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of fun just to jump in and pick some colors, see what you like, and roll with it. My favorite colors, ironically to this day, I love Double Strike. Why do I love Double Strike so much? It was the first deck I ever played. It wasn't my deck. It was a white and red. I think it was like a soldier deck that was all about attacking, haste, so they could attack right when they enter the battlefield. There's no waiting around with summoning sickness where you would need to wait for your next turn for that creature to attack. You're just able to jump right in and begin dealing damage to the opponent. And that is pretty much a staple of how I learned the game and what I love. But it's a very difficult strategy to rely on, because a lot of players play, as we saw in this last World Championship of the weekend, there's a lot of players who will play these ramp decks where they're in it for the long haul. They are prepared to hold you accountable and get into round 7, turn 8. Sometimes you'll have 13 lands on the battlefield, and it's like absurd, where it's so late in the game and you're thinking somebody's going to win. And that's another interesting point I'd love to make, where in some cases it seems like a boring match. Nobody's losing any life, but they're trading resources. And with that comes pain later in the game, when all of a sudden one player who had all of their creature removal spells, they've already exhausted them all, and they accidentally targeted these these not insequential creatures that really weren't going to do a whole lot to the other person's strategy. But in some cases, you might be thinking their strategy is one thing, and then turns out it's a whole different strategy. Just makes for a fun experience.
So I think I asked you this already, but I can't remember what you said. If you pulled, I think the Duskmourn, the top card was one of those fancy Overlord of Hauntwoods. If you pulled that, are you selling it and getting cards for your deck, or are you keeping that puppy? I mean, you got to put it in perspective, because, I mean, you pulled it. Like, this is your baby in your hand. What do you do with it?
So if I pull the most valuable card in the set, it really would boil down to, is this a strategy that I've been meaning to get into? Does this card work with a deck that I already have or am building? Or is this something that I really don't have any interest in? That's a green card, the one that you referenced. So it's from Forests. And sometimes you just may not have a strong forest deck or anything that uses green, and you might say, you know what, this doesn't fit my collection. It would be more beneficial for me to sell it and then use that money to reinvest in other cards or other deck ideas. So it really depends. But if I'm pulling the card, chances are I'm keeping that and I'm going to play it. Of course, I'll sleeve it up, but I will risk that card, finishing play not in perfect condition.
Right.
I love the collecting aspect of Magic, but yeah, I want to play with these cards. I really enjoy, the excitement when you pull one of these valuable cards in person, when you're playing with a friend or playing in a tournament, and you are able to drop that on the battlefield and look at your opponent's reaction. With commander decks or commander gameplay, sometimes you're playing with multiple people. So it's really fun when you've got a teammate and you can utilize an amazing card to work in tandem with your teammate and defeat your opponents. And that brings up, a whole new topic with commander style. But we can get into that another time.
We're in, I think, opposite camps on this, because if I pulled, well, first of all, if I pulled like the best of the best, I have to keep it. That's the kind of stuff I want in my card collection. But aside from that, if it's anything but that, and most of the time you're not pulling the best of the best, I literally will go by like what it looks like and how I feel about it. Like I opened a case of sorcery and I opened a bunch of like one side of it was all no hollows. I was actually getting upset because you're supposed to get 5 per box as kind of like a standard. And so I went through half and got none. And I was like I was getting a little sad. I was like, "Dang, dude, I got a dud basically." And then the second half it had all of them in there. But there were some cool cards and it was called like Marriage Hall, and I mentioned this earlier. If the two of your minions, the particular minions, are in the same square, you just automatically win. So I think for a person that has a deck with those two in it, instantly it's going in the deck, right? If you have King Arthur and what I think Guinevere was her name, if you've got those two in a deck, you're putting this land in your deck. I mean, like, how could you argue against it? But for me, I looked at that and I was like, I literally put a non-foil, so it's gonna have low cash value, low foil unique, because I liked the amount of creatures on it. It had like a couple cats, a unicorn, a tree that had come to life, some fairy in the background. It just looked so sweet. And like that was my flavor. Like I was like, you know what, this is going. And I'm like casting aside the shiny, useful card, and I was like, no, this is where it's at.
There's a really interesting strategy or deck idea in Magic, and it's called like Seven Dwarves or something like this, and you can put typically in a standard game you would be able to put 4 cards of the same exact card in the deck. In this one, I think it's like you can put any number of these, or maybe you could put 7 of them in your deck. Forgive me for not knowing exactly what it is, but it's so hilarious because you can just load your deck with these, and every one of them benefits the other one. So you can just play a whole bunch of them, and now they're increasing the power and toughness of the other ones, and it really starts to defeat the other player because you're just seeing the same creature everywhere, and it's similar to what you're just talking about with a bunch of cats and the unicorn, the tree that's growing and turning into a forest.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be all up my alley. Now, I do need to kind of like stop and smell the roses with the Magic cards and start reading them, and because I like been cruising through the pack openings. But I mean, with sorcery, there's been some that I've been reading, and usually it's because they're foil, so I'm taking extra time to look at them. You know what I mean? Like, because I pull all the cards very quickly like that. And one of them, it literally, you place it down, and it just said, like, from here on out, you control all human troops, like, all human minions. And it's like, there's a sorcery avatar, and he basically spawns foot soldiers nonstop. I watched this in action in my own house, like, and my buddy just started every turn. He's like, I'm placing this land and spawning a foot soldier, and I'm like, can you just do this? Like, how many? It's like a little army, and it's like, can you imagine playing against this guy, and you have built like basically the Spartan 300, and there's no hope for them to win, and they just plop down this card, and it's like, yep, they're all mine now. And it's just like, how deflating would that be?
Wow.
But I want to read the Magic cards and learn that kind of stuff too. It's all gonna start. I gotta finish Arena.
I'll help you out with that.
The tutorial. It was crashing on my phone, but that's what happens when you're getting your breaks done and you're trying to play Magic.
You don't have probably great Wi-Fi over there, no.
Yeah, like none, I think.
Yeah, the white color in Magic is a lot of gaining life, and there's other like green and there's other colors that gain life, but there's a really fun recent deck that I built that was all and only pretty much about gaining life. And then, of course, as Magic does, and the Wizards of the Coast were like, I think it's time for us to release Screaming Nemesis, a creature that reads, if a player is dealt damage, this way, which is if this creature is dealt damage, he can deal damage to any target. So if he then turns that damage and deals it to the opponent, now the opponent can't gain life for the rest of the game. That card, just sitting on the battlefield, would be enough to ruin my entire gaining life deck strategy that I had. So it's funny how some cards, when you stumble upon them or they're produced and it's a brand new card with a whole new idea, it's funny how it can just cut through somebody's deck that it's been unstoppable and really begin to, have you second guessing yourself and saying, what do I need to do to fill my library with a different strategy to avoid one card shutting down my entire process. But it's what makes Magic so fun. I can't get enough of it. And I can't wait to learn more about Pokemon, Sorcery, Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, these are all fun card sets. I know a lot of people are buying these sets and open up packs. It's a really neat, world to be in.
It's going to be difficult, and I don't know where we should go with this, but trying to, get deeper into each of these card games and the trading card, everything from the market to the competitive space, and also being able to, discuss it in a way that's very friendly to those that don't even, that don't know about it. I mentioned a few things, this is our first podcast going on, but it's some people, I'm, talking about sorcery, and they might be like, what even is that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, I think are certainly recognizable by name, but it's also discussing all these mechanics. I guess we'll learn it as we go.
Yeah,
it's all part of the journey.
Oh, yeah. And maybe, we can discover how some very valuable cards, maybe it is simply that card is just so good. The rarity of it might not make a whole lot of difference. It's just the fact that everybody wants it because everybody wants to play with it. I think we see a lot of that with Magic.
They have, and I don't even know why they were important, but it was some sort of relic, and it provided some bonus, but they were these mixtures, aethers or something, and they were highly valuable sorcery cards, but it was because people needed them in their deck. So it is interesting, kind of it's kind of bittersweet for the guy that's collecting and likes to see those big numbers, because once you trespass into the realm of competitive gaming and you have your own deck, you start to betray the market side. You're like, yes, I pulled this card, but I need it.
Yeah. I need to put it in the deck. It can't do enough on the wall.
That's right. So with Arena, I'm guessing you can't it would be cool if you could get your real cards into Arena, and then it represents the cards you actually have.
Well, all it would take is playing the game a little bit to unlock wild cards. And this is a really cool thing that they do in Magic, where every now and then you'll get a pack and you get to open up some cards, and those get added to your collection in the digital space. So those are just obviously digital. You're not going to have anything physical. But these wild cards allow you to search for, say you get a mythic wild card. Well, now you can search any mythic card in Arena, and most of them you're going to find, especially if you're sticking with Standard, are ones that were really printed in the last few years that you can actually play with in real life. And this would be something for you to just say, all right, I want to add to my digital collection and I want to play with it. And so you could build over time, unless you want to just spend the money and say, you know what, I'm just going to pay for a whole bunch of wild cards or whatever you might be able to do on the app. But you would then be able to just build a deck off of those cards that you either have in real life or want to play with. And a lot of the time it's a strategy that works, and you save up a few wild cards and you say, okay, now it's time for me to use these up. I know exactly what I want. Unstoppable Slasher. You can save them. Oh yeah. I'm terrible. I'm really good at saving, but it's not going to do me any good playing anybody. Right now, I've got 27 mythics and 40 rares saved up, which is totally absurd. I should be using them, but I take my time and I develop strategies over the course of weeks or months, and then sometimes it just takes being defeated so quickly with a strategy that I had no idea existed for me to get excited about it, want to build that strategy into one of my decks, or just create a deck off of that strategy, and then I'm burning, 12 wild cards instantly.
How viable is it to just get like a starter deck? Like, can they keep up? Like, if I start Arena and I just have some basic deck, am I just gonna get wiped when I start playing other people?
No, it's really fun. So you would want to know how to play the game, but as far as who you're going to be playing against, if you just play not on ranked, you could be playing against anybody, skilled or not. But if you're playing in ranked, they're going to be pairing you with players who are of your skill level. Unless maybe, say, we have a world champion who creates a whole brand new profile and just starts ransacking the opponents. But it would be easy for you to get a feel for ranked play in the beginning when you're just playing against somebody who might also have just started and are going to be making mistakes. And that was something that we even saw in this last World Championship. One of the matches, there was both somebody who was going to win. I think that might have been Javier himself, and another player. They made mistakes back to back. He makes a mistake during his turn, and then his opponent makes a mistake the very next turn, and they were both almost laughing about it because it's like at that point you rarely make a mistake, and for them it was just so many things were triggering that they overlooked one minor thing, and as soon as it got to the next step of that turn, the judge is not going to let you go, oops, I forgot to do this. So Arena is a lot easier because you're going to kind of get walked through. It's going to help you avoid missing something. You're going to pretty much see that something is triggering something else, and it kind of spoon feeds you that process of, that mechanism or whatnot. It comes back to...
I can't wait to see you in real life and just rip out a Magic deck, and you be like, oh, okay, let me help you walk, and I'm just gonna be like, boom, otter, boom, other otter. Like, you can't beat me.
They're propagating, no. Yeah, so for those of you, we have been friends for a very, very long time and recently reconnected, and we live probably 2,000 miles away from each other. So it's been really fun to once again connect and talk what we love to talk about, Magic and just card games in general, Pokemon, just trading and just understanding the values of these cards, because there's a lot of hidden meanings behind the value of these cards. So it's fun to talk about it with each other and have an audience to hopefully enjoy it as well.
Yeah, no, it's great, man, because I think it's cool having people like, our listeners that are listening are into these things, and connecting with you and you having similar interests, because I have people in my life that I like, and I find time to hang out with, but honestly, it's so far and few in between. Like, we don't meet up a whole lot because, life, there's a lot that life demands, between work and chores and errands and, the holidays, and it's just like never ending. And I really appreciate having, just the podcast even, where we get to sit here and talk about a fun topic, man, because not everybody can really hop into this stuff and just eat it up.
Yep. Well, hopefully it's something that somebody could consume and enjoy if they're sitting in traffic or just trying to learn more about card games in general. That's what we're going to be talking about and trying to give you guys as much material as we can. It's definitely a passion that has only grown, and I would love to bring up Pokemon again, bring us back to square one, because I remember opening up those packs from the original set, and I can't tell you what I opened up. I probably destroyed the cards and chewed on one of them at one point, but over the years it's fun how that never disappeared, the passion for cards and really trying to understand these games and dissect these strategies, because you can factor it into real life. There's so much of it involved, and it really is a wild experience when you see somebody who is talented in one of these tournaments playing with the same deck idea that you may have played with, but really playing with it in a way that shocks you, and saying, okay, there's more to learn. There's more for me to understand. There's a different way of doing the same thing that I didn't know existed. And I just can't get enough of it, man. I just can't get enough.
Well, I look forward to this as a kind of a new journey for me. I remember Pokemon back in the day. I really loved playing the game, and that's something I haven't gotten to do a lot. I've played the Pokemon trading card game of late, and it's not the same experience as it used to be. It's much faster paced, but I find it exciting, and Magic is kind of, I think, the more adult competitive game. It's more complicated, and I think it makes it seem like there's a large barrier to entry, but ultimately, once you get into it and learn it, I think it's going to be more fulfilling in the end.
Yeah,
so I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it can feel like it's overwhelming, but what I would say, if anything, if you're brand new to it, start with like a monocolored deck. Just pick a color that might resonate with you and just build a deck off of that one color and trust it. Just see how it plays and tweak the deck along the way. Figure out how you lose to other people and what their strategies are. Maybe you'll find a card that might add to your strategy, and then you can buy it or you can download it on the app, whatever it might be. It's fun. The term would be crafting it. But it's always a fun experience when you're introduced to a whole new idea, and now you're taking that and running with it and seeing what can happen from it. Because I'll tell you, some of these new deck ideas can end the game on turn 3. Leyline in particular, this card, Leyline of Resonance, is the red one that they recently banned because of how crazy good it is. And, during the tournament, I was following along with the chat, and somebody commented had me laughing so hard. This is a card, Leyline, that it's a 4-mana card, and when you start the game, if you have it in your hand, there's different ley lines. There's like one of each color right now in standard, and one in particular is the one that everybody hates because of how good it is. So you either love it or you hate it. You love it if you have it, you hate it if you're playing against it. And this person commented and said, I counter Leyline with Expelliarmus. And I thought, yep, that's pretty much the only thing you're going to be able to do when you see that card hit the battlefield. There's nothing you can do about it other than pretty much take out a spell and see if it'll do anything. But yeah, I think that's why it was just so overpowered. They had to ban that card. People were winning on turn 3 with only 3 lands. And I think there's a way for you to win on turn 2, but you'd have to have multiple ley lines on the battlefield, which is possible. And we even saw that during the tournament where we had a player play and drop 2 ley lines on the battlefield. I think from their opening hand, so they still had 5 cards in hand with both ley lines on the battlefield. When you see that as the opponent, you're just like, okay, can I concede right now? I mean, we'll give it a couple runs, but this is pretty much game over before it even begins.
No, that's what was happening in Pokemon when I played it a few years ago. It was, you basically either drew your monster card or your opponent did, and it was like if they did and you did not, it was either over in a couple turns or you were just prolonging the inevitable. Like, there was chances you could come back. I mean, it happened, but for the most part, once they got the best out there, I mean, it was just them wiping you. And it was like, it happened the other way around too, but it just kind of became, a little... it wasn't as complicated as Magic, I don't think, either. So it was kind of like everybody was taking off with that same strategy. But I never watched, the highest level competitive play, so maybe there was a counter to it that I didn't understand.
Well, maybe the next podcast I could do some research and try to, in short, cover like a brief idea of the game of Magic and how the turns are and what the colors are, and for those who may be interested in learning more about the game, just to understand how, how to simplify everything so it's not so overwhelming. And between now and then, get some cards, get some packs, rip open some packs and see what you have. It's so fun when you're building a library and a collection that you're going to use to play other players, and knowing that those cards are yours. Of course, you being the collector, Michael, there's plenty of cards that you're going to find that you're going to say, this just deserves to not be, scraped or chipped or destroyed in any way. We don't want to rip this card. Let's just leave it as pristine as possible. But a lot of people are going to want to be able to play with these cards, and I would just recommend find a local shop that might have some tournaments or some sort of gameplay, even if it's friendly gameplay. Your friends might be able to get some packs along with you, and you guys could play each other, or even just play drafting with each other. It doesn't take a whole lot, just 6 decks if you're playing with another player, and you could just take turns rotating decks until you each pull 1 card with every pass until you've got a substantial amount of cards, and just play right then and there and see what comes out of it. It's a lot of fun just to dip your toes into it and see, especially with a set like Duskmorn, what types of horrors await you.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, do you think that about wraps it up here?
I do believe it is time to wrap things up. So did you want to say anything else before we go?
No, I'm looking forward to kind of looking back at this and, making it as good as we can and seeing if we can improve. But I enjoyed this, and I'm kind of looking forward to the topics and the trading cards. So, yeah, I don't have anything else to add, really.
I'm excited to see what comes out of it and where we go from here. So, Michael, as always, pleasure. And you listeners, thanks again for joining us. And we will catch you guys next time.